The reading of the will was set for 2 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon in November, and I remember thinking, as I drove through the gray Hamilton streets with the first real snow of the season collecting on my windshield wipers, that my son had probably already decided how he was going to spend the money. I was 63 years old, recently retired from 31 years of teaching grade 4 at Westdale Elementary, and I had spent the last 14 months watching my older son quietly dismantle every good memory I had of him. I parked in the lot behind the lawyer's office on King Street West, sat in the cold car for a moment longer than I needed to, and then I went inside. My daughter was already there. She was sitting in one of the upholstered chairs in the waiting area, wearing her winter coat still buttoned up, her hands folded in her lap. She looked at me when I walked in, and then she looked away. Toward the window, toward the snow. We had not spoken in over a year. I sat down 2 chairs away from her, and I set my purse on my lap, and I waited, just like she was waiting, for the lawyer to come out and tell us what my husband had left behind. My son arrived 8 minutes late. I heard him before I saw him, the familiar blustering energy of him, his voice carrying through the glass door as he finished a phone call. He came in with snow on his shoulders, and a confidence in his step that I recognized because I had watched him practice it his entire life. He glanced at me. He glanced at his sister. He sat down and checked his watch and said nothing to either of us. I am going to tell you how we got here. My husband Raymond and I were married for 34 years. We built what I can only describe as a quiet life, the kind of life that doesn't make for dramatic stories at dinner parties, but that you understand the value of only once it starts to come apart. Raymond worked as a project manager for a civil engineering firm. I taught children how to read. We bought our house on Charlton Avenue in 1989 for what seemed like an enormous sum of money at the time and turned out to be one of the better decisions we ever made. We had 2 children. Our son was born first in 1985. Our daughter came 3 years later, in 1988. I want to be careful here about how I describe what happened with my son, because I spent a long time believing that I was simply failing to see him clearly, that the problem was my perception and not his behavior. Mothers do that. We find explanations that protect our children from being who they actually are. I told myself for years that my son was ambitious, that he was driven, that the edge I sometimes felt when dealing with him was just the price of raising a child who wanted more than what we'd had. But he was 41 years old when Raymond was diagnosed with the glioblastoma, and by that point he had been borrowing money from us for over a decade. Not small amounts. Not the kind of thing you don't notice. He had gone through a difficult divorce in his early 30s, and Raymond and I had helped with legal fees. He had started a company that hadn't worked out, and we had helped with that too. There were gaps between jobs. There were investment opportunities that required a quick decision. There were home renovations on a property he'd bought in Stony Creek that kept expanding in scope and cost. I did not keep a running total because doing so felt ungenerous, but Raymond did. Raymond kept everything in a spreadsheet that I only saw after he was gone. The number was $247,000 over 11 years. Not 1 cent had ever been paid back, though it had been promised many times. My daughter knew none of this while her father was alive. She was living in Vancouver, working as an occupational therapist, building a life that required nothing from us financially. She called every Sunday. She came home at Christmas and for a week in the summer. She was the kind of adult child who remembered to ask follow-up questions about things you had mentioned weeks earlier, who sent cards on dates that other people forgot. I was proud of her in the uncomplicated way that requires no effort. I am telling you all of this because you need to understand what my son understood, which was that Raymond was dying and that the house on Charlton Avenue was now worth $1.4 million, and that there was also the cottage near Tobermory, the RRSPs, the pension survivor benefits, and the savings account that had been carefully maintained for decades. My son understood that there was something significant to inherit, and he had spent years positioning himself as the child who was present, who helped, who showed up. The fact that showing up meant asking for money did not register as a contradiction to him. Or if it did, he had made peace with it long ago. Raymond's last year was not easy for anyone. The tumor was aggressive. The treatment was brutal and ultimately unsuccessful. I took early retirement to care for him, and my son came by the house frequently during those months, more than he had in years, and at the time I was grateful. I told my daughter that her brother had really stepped up. I believed it. What I did not know was that during those visits, while I was helping Raymond with physiotherapy exercises in the bedroom or driving him to the Juravinsky Cancer Center for treatment, my son was sitting at our kitchen table having a very different kind of conversation with his father. I found out about those conversations in pieces, and I will tell you about them in the order that I found them, because that is how it felt, like a wall you think is solid and then you press your hand against it and pieces just fall away. Raymond died on a Thursday morning in April, the spring before last. He was 67 years old. The lilac bush he had planted in the backyard when our daughter was born was just beginning to come into bloom, and I remember standing at the kitchen window after the palliative care nurse had made her calls, just looking at that bush, thinking that Raymond had loved it every single year, and that this was the first year it would bloom without him knowing. My son arrived within the hour. My daughter flew in from Vancouver the next morning. The three of us managed the first week together in a way that felt, if not warm, then at least functional. There were arrangements to make, phone calls, food brought by neighbors. My son's wife came and helped with things. My daughter slept in her old room and spent long hours sitting with me at the kitchen table, just being present in the way she had always known how to be. The complications began, as they often do, with money. Specifically, they began when my son found out that Raymond had a lawyer, a probate lawyer named Mr. Okafor, with an office on King Street, and that Raymond had revised his will 8 months before his death without telling either of our children. My son found this out because he had, apparently, expected to be consulted. This was the first thing that made me understand how wrong I had been about what was happening. My son did not find out about the revised will and respond with curiosity or patience. He responded with anger, not at a lawyer, not at a process, at me. He sat across from me at the kitchen table 3 days after we had buried his father, and he told me that he knew I had influenced Raymond when Raymond was not in his right mind, that this was not what his father had intended, and that he would be speaking to a lawyer of his own. I did not know what was in the revised will at that point. Mr. Okafor had scheduled the reading for the following week. I told my son that I had no idea what Raymond had changed or why, which was the truth. My son looked at me with an expression I can only describe as contempt, and he said that Raymond had promised him the cottage. There it was. I don't know how long the conversation about the cottage had been going on between Raymond and our son. I don't know how many of those kitchen table visits had involved discussions about what would happen to things after Raymond was gone. I know that Raymond never told me about any of it, and I have spent a long time trying to understand why. And I think the answer is that Raymond was a man who avoided conflict his entire life, and who, when he was dying and frightened, simply could not bring himself to tell our son. The answer was no. Instead, he listened, and he nodded, and he allowed my son to build an expectation out of nothing. And then he went to Mr. Okafor and wrote his actual wishes down in a legally binding document, and he died leaving me to deal with the consequences. I was furious at Raymond for that for months. I want to be honest about that. I loved him and I grieved him, and I was also genuinely angry at him for leaving me with this particular inheritance. My daughter went back to Vancouver 4 days after the funeral. Before she left, she told me that she hoped whatever was in the will was clear and fair, that she didn't need anything, that she was worried about me being alone in the house. She hugged me at the door. I watched her car until I couldn't see it anymore. In the weeks that followed, my son called me every few days. The calls started with questions about how I was doing and moved quickly to questions about the estate. Had I spoken to Mr. Okafor? What had Raymond said to me about his intentions? Was I aware that there were verbal agreements that could have legal standing even without documentation? I listened to all of this and said as little as possible, and felt something settling into place in my chest, something cold and resolved that I had not felt before. The will reading was the Tuesday in November I mentioned at the beginning. Mr. Okafor was a methodical man in his late 50s with reading glasses on a chain around his neck, and the careful, measured manner of someone who had spent decades delivering news that people were not prepared for. He brought us into his office, offered us water, and sat down behind his desk. My son was sitting to my right. My daughter was to my left, still in her coat, which she had never taken off. There was a window behind Mr. Okafor with a view of King Street, and the snow was coming down steadily now, the kind of dry Ontario snow that accumulates quickly. Mr. Okafor put on his glasses and opened the folder in front of him. The house on Charlton Avenue Raymond had left to me, the full property, no conditions, in my name entirely. My son shifted in his chair. The RRSPs and pension survivor benefits went to me as well, as the designated beneficiary, which Mr. Okafor explained was separate from the will itself, and simply proceeded directly. Then Mr. Okafor turned to the matter of the cottage near Tobermory. My son was very still. I could feel it without looking at him. Raymond had left the cottage to my daughter. My son said, very quietly, that there must be a mistake. Mr. Okafor looked at him over his glasses and said there was no mistake. My son said that Raymond had told him, had specifically said, and Mr. Okafor let him finish, and then explained, gently but with no room for misunderstanding, that verbal statements made prior to the signing of a will have no legal standing when a subsequent written will exists, that the will before him was witnessed, notarized, and unambiguous, and that Raymond had been assessed as having full testamentary capacity at the time of signing, which had been documented specifically because Raymond himself had requested it, apparently anticipating that the question might be raised. My son turned and looked at me. I looked back at him. Mr. Okafor continued. Raymond had also left a letter, he said. A personal letter, not a legal document, but included with the will at Raymond's request and to be read aloud in the event that both children were present at the reading. Mr. Inheri Towe. Okafor looked up and confirmed that both children were present. He asked if we wished him to proceed. My daughter said yes. My son said nothing. I am going to tell you what was in that letter. I am going to tell you because it is the thing I have thought about more than anything else in the past 14 months, and because I think it is the only way to explain why I am at peace with what happened, even though the aftermath was ugly. Raymond wrote that he had loved both of his children. He wrote that he had not been a perfect father, and that he had known this while it was still possible to do something about it, and had not always done enough. He wrote that he had allowed a pattern to develop with his son that had cost this family more than money, and that he had been a coward about confronting it, and that he was sorry. He wrote that the $247,000 advanced to his son over 11 years was documented in a spreadsheet on the family computer under a folder called Accounts, and that he had considered this money a loan, but had never enforced repayment because he had not wanted the argument, and that he understood this had been a failure of honesty rather than an act of generosity. He wrote that he had revised his will to reflect what he actually believed was fair, which was not the same as what he had sometimes seemed to agree to in conversations that he should have handled differently, and that he was sorry for the confusion he had caused by not being clearer when he was alive. Then Raymond wrote something I was not expecting. He wrote that he was leaving a separate amount of $5,000 to his son, not because he believed it was equivalent to anything, but because he had looked it up and understood that in Ontario, leaving a nominal amount was the clearest way to demonstrate that the omission of a larger bequest was intentional and not an oversight. He wrote that he was not trying to humiliate his son. He wrote that he hoped his son would use the years he had left, years that Raymond himself no longer had to build something that was actually his own. And then he wrote to my daughter. He wrote that she had grown into someone he admired, that he had sometimes taken her steadiness for granted because steadiness is easy to overlook, and that he was sorry for that too. He wrote that the cottage had been the place where he had watched her learn to swim, where she had read her first chapter book on the dock, where she had, at age 9, identified 17 different species of birds with a field guide she'd found at a garage sale and carried with her all week. He wrote that he wanted her to have it because he wanted those memories to stay in hands that had held them carefully. Mr. Okafor finished reading and removed his glasses and set them on the folder. My daughter was crying quietly. She had her hands pressed together in her lap, and she was looking at the window. My son stood up. He did not say anything to me, and he did not say anything to his sister, and he did not say anything to Mr. Okafor. He walked out of the office, and I heard the glass door, and then nothing. Just the sound of the snow outside. I want to tell you what the months after that looked like, because I think it would be dishonest to tell you that the letter solved everything. My son did not speak to me for 6 months. His wife sent a brief email about the $5,000 procedural, polite, nothing beyond the transaction. My daughter called me from Vancouver the night of the reading, and we talked for almost 2 hours, the first real conversation we'd had in longer than I wanted to admit, and at the end she said she didn't know what to do with the cottage, that it felt enormous, and I told her that she didn't have to know right away. I went through that first winter alone in the house on Charlton Avenue. I shoveled the walk myself most mornings, and I continued the practice Raymond and I had started years ago of keeping a bird feeder outside the kitchen window. And I worked through the particular grief of learning who your husband actually was not worse than you thought. Not exactly, but more complicated, more frightened, more human than the version you had been living with. I read his spreadsheet, all of it. I read it several times. I found a note at the bottom in a cell that I almost missed, dated 8 years ago, that said, "I don't know how to stop this and I don't want to lose him." I sat with that for a long time. In February, my son called. It was a Sunday morning, and I was drinking coffee and watching the birds at the feeder. He called, and then he didn't say anything for a moment, and then he said, "Mom," and the way he said it told me everything. I did not make it easier for him. I waited. He said he had been doing some thinking. He said that he had gone back and looked at some things, that his wife had helped him look at some things, that there was a lot he hadn't wanted to see. He said he understood now that some of what he had told himself over the years about the money wasn't accurate, that he had been telling himself a story that let him feel like a victim of circumstances rather than someone who kept making the same choice. He said he was ashamed of how he had left Mr. Okafor's office. I let him say all of it. Then I told him that I missed his father. I told him that I had been angry at his father for some time, but that I had also come to understand what Raymond had been trying to protect, which was not just the estate but the possibility that our family could still be repaired after he was gone. I told my son that I believed his father had written that letter not to punish him but because Raymond had finally done the thing he was never able to do in person, which was tell the truth, and that the truth was a beginning even when it didn't feel like one. My son cried. I had not heard him cry since he was a child, and the sound of it unmade me in a way I had not expected. I cried too. We stayed on the phone for a long time after that, not saying very much, just staying on the line the way you do when the connection itself is the point. The following July, my daughter flew home from Vancouver. She drove up to Tobermory with me, and the three of us, my son and his wife, came to open the cottage for the first time since Raymond's death. Someone had to go through his things, and we did it together. And it was hard in the way that those things are hard, and it was also something else. My son found the old tackle box on the shelf in the back room where Raymond had always kept it, and he sat down on the step and held it for a long time without saying anything. My daughter sat next to him. I stayed in the kitchen and gave them that. We had dinner together the first night with the windows open and the bugs coming in against the screens and the smell of the lake coming through the door. My son's wife made pasta. My daughter brought wine. We talked about Raymond and we laughed about some things and were quiet about others, and the evening came down slowly over the water the way it does up there in the summer, taking a long time to get dark. I thought about the spreadsheet. I thought about the letter. I thought about the lilac bush and the bird feeder and 34 years of a quiet life, and the way grief works on you slowly, like water on stone, changing the shape of things without you noticing, until one day you look and the shape is different, and you understand that different is not the same as gone. My daughter has been up to the cottage twice on her own since then. She is talking about spending a longer stretch there next summer. She has started keeping a list of birds she sees from the dock, and when she told me this on the phone, I had to be very careful about my voice. My son is still figuring things out. I think he is going to be okay. I think he wants to be, and I have learned that wanting is not nothing. I am 63 years old, and I am still in the house on Charlton Avenue, and the lilac bush bloomed again this spring, later than usual because it was a cold May, but it came. I stood at the kitchen window and watched it, and I did not feel only sad. I felt some other thing too, something that sits alongside the sadness rather than replacing it, something that took me a long time to recognize because I hadn't felt it in quite this form before. I think the word is forward, not okay, not healed, not fixed, just forward. Like a car driving into the first snow of November, wipers going, finding the road ahead even when you can't see very far down it. Finding it and staying on it and going, that's all you can really do, isn't it? You just keep going.